At 95, the tragedy of Robert Wagner is beyond heartbreaking. On a black, freezing night in late November 1981, a star vanished into water she feared all her life. At dawn, Natalie Wood, Hollywood's incandescent muse, was found adrift near Catalina, still in a nightgown and a crimson coat that looked almost scripted by fate. The official word said accident. The bruises, the scratches, the missing hours, and a lifelong terror of deep water whispered something darker. Whispers multiplied. Jealousy, an argument, a decision no one could undo. The yacht had a name, Splendor, but what happened aboard it was anything but. For decades, the story sank and resurfaced, each wave carrying new fragments. A captain's revised testimony, neighbors who claimed to hear a woman cry for help, investigators who reopened the file and changed the death certificate to drowning and other undetermined factors. The names became talismans of doubt. Robert Wagner, Christopher Walken, Dennis Davern, and the night became a riddle with too many answers and not enough light. Now, at 95, the man who loved her and lived beneath suspicion longer than most actors live on screen, the man called a person of interest, then left in a limbo of grief and rumor, finally breaks his long, careful silence. Is this the confession of a villain, or the testimony of a widower who cannot outrun one terrible night? We'll retrace every step, the laughter before the storm, the shattering glass, the drifting dinghy, the altered autopsy, the witnesses who wouldn't forget, and the words Wagner chose when time ran out on excuses. The ocean kept its secret, but memory leaks. The darkest truth wasn't in the water, it was in the timeline no one could explain. Before the silence of that November night, Robert Wagner and Natalie Wood had been Hollywood's perfect illusion of eternal love. He was the golden boy of post-war America, all polish and poise, the kind of man who could walk into a room and make everyone believe the movies were real. She was the dream those movies promised, luminous, fragile, and unreachable. Together, they were a picture the world adored: youth, beauty, and the intoxicating belief that love could outshine fame. But behind the photographs and premieres lived a far more complicated truth. Robert Wagner, born in 1,930 inches Detroit, had fought his way up from bit parts and background roles to become a leading man in the golden age of the studio system. He was handsome, refined, but never quite the rebel Hollywood demanded in the age of Brando and Dean. He played charm like an instrument, and he mastered it well. Natalie, meanwhile, was already a veteran by the time most children were learning multiplication. She'd begun acting at 4 years old, under bright lights that rarely dimmed for the rest of her life. By 16, she had earned an Academy Award nomination for Rebel Without a Cause, a role that exposed both her brilliance and her fragility. Their first encounter felt like fate written in cinema. Natalie, only 10 years old, had seen Wagner at a restaurant and whispered to her mother, "Someday, I'll marry that man." 12 years later, she did. Their wedding in 1957 was the crown jewel of gossip columns. The photographs gleamed: the one 9-year-old starlet in white lace, the two 7-year-old actor with perfect posture and eyes full of promise. They embodied the dream Hollywood sold to the world, but the spotlight that illuminates also burns. Wagner's career, though steady, began to fade as Natalie soared. West Side Story and Splendor in the Grass made her a legend. Wagner became the husband who waited at home. The imbalance quietly poisoned their marriage. Friends recalled whispered arguments in dressing rooms and long silences after red carpets. By 1962, their perfect union shattered into divorce, a tragedy for the press and a private collapse for them both. Yet destiny, as it often does in Hollywood, gave them a sequel. A decade later, in 1972, they remarried, two survivors trying to rewrite their story. They believed time and pain had taught them what youth had not. "We went through hell to find each other again," Natalie told an interviewer, her voice soft but defiant. It felt like redemption until the night the ocean took her back. By then, both had become veterans of fame's cruel rhythms. Wagner starred in the hit television series Heart to Heart, his charisma intact but his innocence gone. Natalie, returning to film after years away, began shooting Brainstorm with Christopher Walken, whose intellect and intensity fascinated her. Their connection on set sparked rumors, the kind of rumors Wagner, now older and more possessive, couldn't ignore. It was this triangle, husband, wife, and co-star, that set the stage for that final weekend aboard the yacht Splendor. A Thanksgiving trip meant for laughter turned into a slow spiral of jealousy, alcohol, and secrets. The night would end not in celebration, but in the sound of water closing over a scream no one could quite place. Hollywood has always loved a good mystery, but this one was real. And as the decades passed, the line between truth and tragedy blurred until it became impossible to separate the man from the myth. Even now, with Robert Wagner at 95, the story remains unfinished. Every new interview, every confession, every reopened case feels like another attempt to drain the ocean of secrets, but the waves keep coming back. The calm before the storm was always the cruelest illusion, because the love story of Natalie Wood and Robert Wagner was never just about romance. It was about control, jealousy, and the one night when both love and fear drowned together. Long before she became a Hollywood mystery, Natalie Wood was a child of war, wonder, and fear. She was born Natalia Nikolaevna Zakharenko in 1,938 inches, San Francisco, the daughter of Russian immigrants who had fled political chaos in Europe. Her father, Nikolai, had once been an artist and a carpenter. Her mother, Maria, lived in constant awe of movie stars. It was Maria who first looked at her dark-eyed little girl and saw destiny. "My daughter," she once said, "was born for the camera." Hollywood was a dream too large for most, but Maria was relentless. She took little Natalie to open auditions, waving her photographs at casting agents, hoping someone would notice. And someone did. At just 4 years old, Natalie appeared in her first film, Happy Land 1943. The director was so captivated by her presence that he demanded more close-ups. In that instant, a career began, one that would both crown and curse her. Natalie's childhood was scripted by studios. While other children played outside, she memorized lines and smiled through exhaustion. Fame arrived early, but so did the cost. Her mother, desperate to keep her daughter's image spotless, controlled everything. Her clothes, her weight, even her friendships. She warned Natalie never to cry on set, and if she did, she should do it beautifully. Behind every tear was discipline, a performance even in pain. One haunting memory followed Natalie for the rest of her life. During the filming of The Green Promise, 1949, when she was just 10, a stunt involving a collapsing bridge went wrong. She was thrown into the rushing water, terrified, unable to swim. The scene was used in the film, but the fear became permanent. From that day on, Natalie was terrified of deep water. She never fully recovered from it, even as she grew into one of the most graceful stars in Hollywood. That fear, the kind that freezes the soul, would later become the cruel echo of her death. By her teenage years, Natalie Wood was no longer the sweet child star. She was a young woman trapped in the machine of fame. At 15, she was already working alongside giants James Dean in Rebel Without a Cause, a film that defined a generation. It also defined her image, vulnerable, rebellious, aching for connection. The public saw a girl coming of age on screen. Few noticed the loneliness behind her eyes. In interviews, Natalie often spoke softly about her dreams. She wanted to be respected, not just adored. She wanted to choose roles that mattered, not just look beautiful. "I'm not trying to be a star," she once said. "I'm trying to be an actress." But Hollywood didn't easily forgive young women who wanted depth. The industry built her into an icon and trapped her inside it. Robert Wagner's early years were no less shaped by longing. Born in 1,930 inches, Detroit, to a middle-class family, Robert grew up during the Great Depression. His father was a steel executive, strict and distant, while his mother filled the house with the quiet ache of unfulfilled dreams. From a young age, Robert wanted to escape not from poverty, but from invisibility. He found his first stage not in theater, but in mirrors. He practiced charm, posture, and that perfect half smile that would later make casting directors melt. After high school, he moved to Los Angeles, working odd jobs and waiting tables until a talent scout spotted him. Within months, he signed with 20th Century Fox. Like many men of the 1,950 seconds, Wagner's early career was built on image more than artistry. He wasn't a method actor or a brooding poet like Brando. He was clean-cut, reliable, and romantic. He became the quintessential leading man of mid-century Hollywood, starring in Beneath the 12-Mile Reef and Prince Valiant. Audiences loved him. Critics called him handsome wallpaper. Then came Natalie Wood. She was 8 years younger, radiant, and already a bigger star. To Robert, she was everything he dreamed of, proof that he belonged in Hollywood's inner circle. To Natalie, he was safety in a world that devoured innocence. Together, they built a fragile sanctuary in each other's arms. Yet both carried invisible scars, hers from control and fear, his from pride and inadequacy. That combination, her need to be loved and his need to be admired, would later ignite like gasoline. It was a love forged in mirrors and movie sets, both passionate and perilous. By the time they married in 1957, they were Hollywood royalty. But even in the early photographs, something uneasy hides in their smiles, a sense that both were performing not just for cameras, but for themselves. Natalie's childhood fear of drowning, the one that began on that film set years before, lingered like an unspoken prophecy. And when her life ended in dark water decades later, the story would circle back to that little girl on the broken bridge, a child crying out, unheard, beneath the roar of the river. The fears we bury in childhood never truly disappear. They only wait for the moment when memory and fate collide. By the mid-1950s, Natalie Wood had become more than a child prodigy. She was the new face of young America. Her beauty had a softness that could break your heart, and her eyes carried the kind of pain that no script could teach. When she stood beside James Dean in Rebel Without a Cause, she became an icon of rebellion, loneliness, and desire all at once. The film earned her an Oscar nomination at just 17, and overnight, the little girl from Happy Land was gone. In her place stood a woman who knew that fame could both feed and devour you. Hollywood's studio system adored her. Directors called her the girl who could cry on cue. Producers called her bankable. But Natalie wanted something more dangerous: truth. She began taking roles that challenged her. In Splendor in the Grass, 1961, and West Side Story, 1961, both films that mirrored her own emotional turmoil. Each performance drew from the well of her past: the strict mother, the longing for love, the fear of losing control. Behind every role was a flicker of her real self, burning quietly beneath the makeup. At the same time, Robert Wagner's career was rising on a parallel path. After years of being dismissed as too pretty to be taken seriously, he began proving himself on television, a medium that rewarded charm over depth. He became a household name through shows like It Takes a Thief, and later Heart to Heart, where his suave demeanor became his signature. He was admired, adored, yet often underestimated. Fame, for Wagner, was both validation and vulnerability. When their paths crossed again in Hollywood's small, glittering social world, it was magnetic. The newspapers called them Hollywood's royal couple, and for a time, they believed it. Their first marriage in 1957 was the kind of fairy tale that sold magazines young lovers in tuxedo and tulle, flashes from 100 cameras, the promise of forever sealed with champagne. But Natalie was already beginning to see the cracks. Her star shone brighter than Wagner's, and Hollywood, with its cruel arithmetic of ego, began whispering. Friends recalled Wagner growing uneasy at how the press spoke of Natalie Wood, the genius actress, while he was simply her husband. For a man raised to measure worth in power and perception, it was a slow humiliation. Behind the scenes, Natalie faced pressures of her own. She was expected to be perfect, the devoted wife, the elegant hostess, the unblemished star. But her emotions were fierce and uncontainable. She loved passionately, fought fiercely, and forgave quickly. When she felt caged, she ran not from people but from silence. Their arguments were legendary among friends. Champagne glasses breaking, apologies written on napkins, and makeups that could have been movie scenes. Yet, despite all the chaos, they kept returning to each other. "We had an intensity," Wagner once admitted, "that burned through everything good or bad." By 1962, however, the fire had consumed too much. The tabloids published stories of affairs, jealousy, and drunken parties. Natalie, exhausted, filed for divorce. She was only 24, already a veteran of heartbreak. For years afterward, she drifted through roles and romances, trying to find the version of herself that fame had taken away. Then came the second act, the improbable reunion. In the early 1970s, after failed marriages and fading spotlight, they found each other again. They were older, scarred, and perhaps wiser. To their friends, it looked like fate's redemption. "We were meant to be together," Natalie said in an interview. "We just didn't know how to do it the first time. It is gone." They remarried in 1972 on a yacht off Malibu, the same setting that would one day become their undoing. To the world, they looked serene. To those close to them, the same old tensions flickered beneath the surface. Wagner's charm, Natalie's restlessness. It was a loop they could never escape. But Hollywood loves a second chance, and so did they. The birth of their daughter, Courtney, seemed to calm the storms for a while. Natalie took a break from acting to raise her family, while Wagner's television career soared. He became a symbol of polished masculinity on American screens, while she became the quiet muse at home, her own dreams dimmed by motherhood and expectation. Then, in 1981, came Brainstorm, the science fiction drama that would mark her final role. Acting alongside Christopher Walken, a man as enigmatic as she was emotional, Natalie rediscovered a spark, the thrill of being challenged again. Walken's quiet intensity reminded her of Dean. It reminded Wagner of everything he feared. The tension began to build. That year, as the Thanksgiving holiday approached, the couple decided to take a trip aboard their yacht, Splendor, joined by Walken and the ship's captain, Dennis Davern. It was meant to be a peaceful weekend away from the cameras, a reminder of simpler times. But for people like Natalie and Robert, there was no such thing as simple anymore. Every gesture, every glance was loaded with history, love, jealousy, and 1,000 unresolved arguments. The boat carried not just passengers, but decades of buried resentment and fear. No one knew that this voyage would become one of Hollywood's most enduring tragedies. The ocean doesn't keep secrets, it only delays their discovery. And on that cold November night, the Splendor would drift straight into infamy. By the late 1970 seconds, Natalie Wood and Robert Wagner had become something more than a Hollywood couple. They were symbols of resilience. Two stars who had fallen apart, burned in the tabloids, and still somehow found their way back to each other. Their faces appeared on glossy magazine covers again, framed by words like reborn and forever. To the public, they had survived what most couldn't: fame, failure, and the slow disintegration of love. Natalie, now in her 40s, glowed with a kind of seasoned grace. She wasn't the wide-eyed girl from Rebel Without a Cause anymore. She was a woman who had tasted heartbreak and learned to carry it elegantly. She often told friends, "I don't want to be a legend, I just want to be human." Yet, that was the cruel paradox the world wouldn't let her. Every move she made, every smile, every silence was dissected by an audience that believed her life belonged to them. In that same period, Wagner had achieved what he always wanted: control. His television series Heart to Heart, alongside Stephanie Powers, was a massive success. He played Jonathan Hart, the charming millionaire detective, suave, loyal, perfect. America adored him for it. But behind the camera, Wagner was no longer playing a role. He was living it. He had the mansion, the family, the power, and the woman he loved. Still, there was a tension beneath that golden surface, a feeling that something fragile was waiting to break. Natalie, meanwhile, was restless again. The long break she'd taken from acting to focus on family had left a quiet ache in her. She missed the craft, the purpose. When she was offered the role in Brainstorm 1981, opposite Christopher Walken, she saw it as her return. One last chance to prove that she was still more than a memory. Walken, with his eerie charisma and intellectual calm, fascinated her. On set, she called him brilliant, weird, and honest. They talked for hours about art, ambition, and fear, the kind of conversations she hadn't had in years. Robert noticed. He always noticed. Friends later recalled that Wagner's jealousy began quietly, like a current under calm water. He'd smile in public, but his questions grew sharper at home. "Why are you always with him? Why does he make you laugh like that?" It wasn't rage, not yet. It was insecurity wrapped in charm. Still, the couple seemed inseparable in public. They attended premieres arm in arm, smiled for the cameras, spoke fondly of each other in interviews. The world saw devotion. They hid exhaustion. It's a familiar story in Hollywood: the brighter the lights, the darker the shadows. In private, Natalie's friends noticed her growing unease. She told her sister Lana she felt trapped again, torn between loyalty to Wagner and the creative spark she'd rediscovered with Walken. Lana would later recall her sister's words: "I can't stand fights anymore. I just want peace." That peace never came. The final Thanksgiving weekend of 1981 began like any other glittering Hollywood escape. The Splendor, their yacht, sat anchored near Catalina Island, a serene paradise surrounded by cold, merciless water. Wagner, Natalie, Walken, and Captain Dennis Davern boarded with laughter and wine. They toasted to success, to friendship, to the illusion of calm. But beneath the clinking glasses, there was static in the air. Walken admired Natalie's independence, something Wagner had always tried to contain. As night fell, the champagne flowed freely, and so did resentment. Captain Davern later recalled that Wagner's mood shifted suddenly, that his eyes hardened when he saw Natalie laughing too warmly at Walken's jokes. Dinner turned into tension. Laughter faded. The sound of the waves began to drown out conversation. Then, the first crack, Wagner's voice, sharp, cutting through the cabin. "Why don't you just stay with him?" he allegedly said. Walken, trying to defuse the moment, stood up and left the table. Natalie followed him. Wagner followed her. What happened in those next moments remains one of the most contested mysteries in Hollywood history. A bottle of wine shattered, shouting, silence. Then Natalie gone. That was the last time anyone saw her alive. When dawn broke on the 29th of November 1981, the Pacific was still. Natalie Wood's body was found floating face down, her nightgown clinging to her, her skin pale against the water. The crimson jacket she wore made the scene look like something out of a film, surreal, cinematic, and unbearably tragic. The official report called it accidental drowning, but the bruises on her body, the scratches on her arms and face, told another story. So did the timeline. Wagner had waited more than 4 hours before alerting authorities that his wife was missing. 4 hours in freezing water. The public wanted answers. The police reopened the case. Friends of Natalie whispered that Wagner had always been possessive. The captain of the Splendor, Dennis Davern, began to change his story, saying he had been pressured to keep quiet. He claimed Wagner had stopped him from turning on the yacht's searchlights, saying, "Leave her there, she'll come back." In that single line, the myth began. Hollywood had lost its princess, and America had found a mystery it would never solve. News anchors read her name in hushed tones. Fans left flowers along the shore, and Robert Wagner, dressed in black at the funeral, stood motionless beside the casket, his eyes hidden behind dark glasses. Some called it grief, others called it guilt. The story became legend, the love that ended in the water. Natalie's final film, Brainstorm, was released 2 years later. It was dedicated to her memory. Walken, shaken, never spoke publicly about that night again. Wagner returned to acting, but never again without the shadow of suspicion. The tragedy froze them both in time, the eternal young lovers, now separated by death and doubt. And as the years turned to decades, the mystery of that night refused to fade. Behind the applause, behind the love story, lay the storm that no one saw coming and the questions that would haunt Hollywood for more than 40 years. The night of the 28th of November, 1981, began with laughter and ended in silence that still echoes across Hollywood. On the yacht Splendor, anchored off Catalina Island, 4 people sat around a dinner table. Natalie Wood, Robert Wagner, Christopher Walken, and Captain Dennis Davern. The sea was calm, the air crisp, and the wine bottles endless. It should have been a tranquil escape, a short Thanksgiving weekend among friends. But beneath the surface, something restless stirred. Natalie was radiant, animated, teasing Walken about his strange philosophies. He spoke softly, amused. Wagner, sitting opposite them, smiled thinly, his eyes clouded with something unreadable. As the night deepened, the air thickened with alcohol and jealousy. Small remarks became sparks. Captain Davern would later describe it as a quiet storm brewing, one that no one dared stop. Around 10:30 p.m., the tone shifted. A glass shattered. Voices rose. Walken, uncomfortable, retreated to his cabin. Davern followed Wagner and Natalie to the deck, where an argument was unfolding. "You care more about your career than your family," Wagner shouted. Natalie's voice trembled in reply. "And you care more about control than love." It was the last argument they would ever have. Minutes later, there was silence, the kind that feels wrong, too heavy to be peace. Davern claimed he heard Wagner mutter something under his breath, then footsteps, then nothing but the soft rhythm of the tide. At 11 p.m., Natalie was gone. The next hours are the abyss where fact and fiction dissolve. According to Wagner, she must have gone to check on the dinghy, the small rubber boat tied to the yacht, and accidentally fallen in. But even as he said it, the story cracked. Natalie had always been terrified of dark water. She couldn't swim. She wouldn't have gone alone. At 11:30 on a nearby yacht named the Capricorn, 2 witnesses, Marilyn Wayne and John Payne, heard a woman's voice cry out into the darkness. "Help me, please, someone help me." The screams lasted nearly 15 minutes. Then came a man's calm voice replying, "Okay, honey, we'll get you." But no one did. No engine started, no lights turned on. Only the waves answered her. When dawn broke, Natalie's body was found floating a mile from the splendor. Her nightgown clung to her skin. Her crimson coat fanned out like a dying rose on the water's surface. The dinghy, Valiant, drifted nearby, engine off, keys still in ignition, oars tied down. Nothing about the scene made sense. The coroner, Dr. Thomas Noguchi, reported bruises on her arms and face, scratches along her neck, and abrasions on her legs, all sustained before she entered the water. Her blood alcohol level was 0.14%, high but not fatal. Combined with painkillers and seasickness medication, it meant she was disoriented but conscious. The report concluded, accidental drowning. But many in the LAPD quietly disagreed. For years, the story lay dormant until 2011, when Captain Dennis Davern broke his silence. In a televised interview, his voice quivered as he said, "I lied on my original statement. Robert told me not to call anyone. He stopped me from turning on the searchlights. He told me to leave her there." Those words detonated like a bomb. The case was reopened. Natalie's death certificate was amended from accidental drowning to drowning and other undetermined factors. For the first time in decades, Robert Wagner was named a person of interest. When questioned again, Wagner's answers were fragmented, evasive. "We argued," he admitted. "Maybe I said things I shouldn't have, but then she walked away. I thought she just needed to be alone." Investigators pointed out the inconsistencies. If he truly feared for her safety, why wait 4 hours to alert authorities? Why stop the captain from using the searchlight? Why had so many details of his story changed over the years? In 2018, Lieutenant John Carina of the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department said publicly, "Robert Wagner was the last person with Natalie Wood before she went missing. His story does not add up." Still, no charges were filed. The evidence was circumstantial bruises, contradictions, and fear, but no witness to the moment she fell. The ocean had swallowed the truth. Natalie's sister, Lana Wood, refused to let it rest. She accused Wagner openly. "I believe Robert killed my sister," she said in countless interviews. Her voice, steady but shaking, cut through Hollywood's hush. "He knows more than he will ever say." The media turned the tragedy into a saga, part love story, part crime, part myth. Wagner became a ghost walking through his own life, forever tied to a single question: was it an accident or something darker? As years passed, every retelling added another layer of speculation. Books, documentaries, podcasts, all chasing the same phantom truth. In one documentary, an LAPD investigator said, "We're not closing it, not until we can prove what really happened." But as the witnesses aged and memories blurred, the case became an echo of itself. Wagner, in rare interviews, spoke only in sorrow. "That night took everything from me," he said. "My wife, my peace, my life as I knew it." He denied violence, denied anger, but never denied guilt, not in the legal sense, but in the emotional one. "I was the last person with her," he admitted quietly. "That will never leave me." Even Christopher Walken, usually silent, gave one cryptic remark years later. "You can't expect answers from the sea. It keeps what it wants. Isn't any hold. Isn't Adberts." It's the kind of line that feels like poetry until you realize it might also be truth. In the end, what remains is the imagery, the yacht rocking gently in the fog, the echo of a woman's scream swallowed by the wind, the indifferent rhythm of the waves. A love story that began in light, ended in darkness, and the ocean still whispers her name. Time buries evidence, but it cannot bury emotion. The tragedy didn't end with Natalie's death. It lived on in Robert Wagner's silence, a silence that became both his shield and his prison. After that night, Robert Wagner's world became unbearably small. The yacht was sold. The laughter that once filled his home turned into long silences. Hollywood still smiled when it saw him, but everyone knew behind that smile lived a ghost. The man once known for his composure and charm now moved through the world like someone who had forgotten what peace felt like. In the early 1980 seconds, reporters chased him everywhere. Microphones thrust at his face, asking the same question he could never answer. What really happened that night? His responses were careful, almost rehearsed. "It was a terrible accident," he would say. "There's nothing more to tell." But his eyes told another story, one of sleepless nights and guilt that refused to fade. In public, he tried to continue as if nothing had changed. He kept working, appearing in Heart to Heart in several TV films. But his energy was different now, quieter, gentler, almost apologetic. He carried grief like a coat he couldn't take off. For Natalie's fans, the tragedy became a wound that never healed. Her final film, Brainstorm, was released posthumously in 1983. Every frame of her smiling on screen felt like a ghost reaching out from before the fall. The end credits read simply, "For Natalie." Audiences wept, critics mourned, and Wagner, sitting alone at the premiere, never said a word. Years turned into decades. He remarried actress Jill Street John, his longtime friend, and together they built a quiet life far from Hollywood's noise. But even in his peace, Natalie's shadow followed him. In interviews, his voice would still falter at her name. "She was the love of my life," he once whispered to a journalist. "I think about her every day." He spent his later years raising his daughters, Natasha Gregson Wagner and Courtney Wagner, trying to shield them from the endless speculation that still followed their family. Natasha, Natalie's daughter from her marriage to producer Richard Gregson, defended him fiercely. "He loved my mother," she said. "I've seen that pain in him my entire life." It is lad of date same's win. In 2016, Natasha released a memoir titled More Than Love, in which she wrote about the bond between her stepfather and her mother, a complicated, imperfect love that even death couldn't erase. "My father isn't a murderer," she wrote. "He's a man haunted by grief." For the public, her words reignited debate. Some found them moving, others saw them as loyalty wrapped in denial. But for Natasha, the truth was simple. "I choose love, because hate only keeps her death alive." By the time Wagner reached his 90s, he had withdrawn almost completely from public life. He stopped attending interviews, stopped defending himself. His health declined slowly, his appearances rare. When he did speak, his voice trembled, as if each word carried the weight of decades. "I've made mistakes," he admitted in one of his final interviews, "and I've paid for them every day since." Friends said he found solace in routine morning walks. Old photographs, letters, Natalie had written in her looping, delicate handwriting. Sometimes he would take out their wedding picture, touch her face with his thumb, and sit for hours in silence. In 2025, when news surfaced that Robert Wagner, now 95, had finally spoken again about the night Natalie died, the world leaned in. His voice, frail but deliberate, carried through the recording. "I was angry. I was drunk. I said things I shouldn't have. I turned away when I should have looked. People think that's confession. It's not. It's regret. And I've lived with it longer than anyone should." Whether those words were redemption or repetition, no one could tell. But for the first time, he sounded less like a man defending himself and more like one surrendering to memory. The sea had taken Natalie, but time had taken Wagner. And perhaps that was its own form of justice, a slow, unending reckoning that no court could deliver. When guilt becomes a companion, it no longer punishes, it simply stays. And in Robert Wagner's final years, the silence he once used to hide behind became the only truth he had left. More than 4 decades after that cold November night, the names Natalie Wood and Robert Wagner no longer belong only to Hollywood. They belong to legend, whispered in the same breath as Marilyn Monroe and Dean. Their story has become one of those eternal cautionary tales. Beauty and love transformed into myth by tragedy. Natalie Wood's legacy remains untouchable. She was one of the rare women of mid-century Hollywood who managed to break free from the child star curse and become a genuine artist. Her films Rebel Without a Cause, Splendor in the Grass, West Side Story are taught in film schools as lessons in emotional truth. Each role she played carried the echoes of her own life: longing, fear, and the fragile courage to love again. To younger generations who never saw her alive, she's a haunting presence, her photos glowing in sepia, her voice preserved in celluloid. She was a symbol of grace and of the cost of that grace. She had the face of an angel, her co-star James Garner once said, and the soul of someone who'd already seen too much. But Natalie's legacy is also a warning: how easily a woman's life, achievements, and death can be rewritten by rumor. For years, her talent was overshadowed by the mystery of her final hours. Her tragedy became content, her fear of water a metaphor. She became both saint and victim, frozen in headlines, never allowed to grow old. Robert Wagner's legacy is more complicated. To some, he is still the suave leading man who brought charisma and class to television. To others, he is the man who may have gotten away with murder. The duality of his image, charm, and suspicion turned him into one of Hollywood's most debated figures. Yet there's something undeniably human about the way his story ended. Wagner never truly tried to defend himself, he simply endured. Decade after decade, he lived under a shadow he couldn't escape, not through denial or confession. In time, even his silence became part of the myth. For Natalie's sister, Lana Wood, the case is unfinished business. She continues to speak, to write, to demand justice. Her persistence keeps the case alive, a heartbeat in the dark. Natalie was more than a story, she once said. She was a woman who deserved the truth. For Lana, the tragedy is not just a death, it's the unanswered question that became her life's purpose. In contrast, Natalie's daughter, Natasha, represents the other side of legacy, forgiveness. Her memoir, More Than Love, was not about clearing her father's name, it was about surviving grief. Love doesn't disappear when someone dies, she wrote. It just changes form. Her decision to defend Wagner divided the public, but it gave the family something Hollywood never could piece. Today, the Natalie Wood case stands as one of the entertainment industry's great unsolved mysteries. It sits beside the stories of Sharon Tate, Brittany Murphy, and others whose deaths blurred the line between fame and fate. Yet Natalie's story remains singular, because it isn't just about how she died, it's about how the world refused to let her rest. Documentaries, podcasts, and books still revisit the same fragments of that night. The screams, the bruises, the dinghy, the silence. Investigators call it a case with no bottom. Fans call it the tragedy that won't sink. But for those who knew her, the obsession feels cruel, a refusal to let her memory exist outside her death. And yet, perhaps that's the cost of immortality. The ocean that took her also preserved her, turning her story into something timeless, tragic, and strangely poetic. Every generation rediscovers her through the same grainy photographs, the smile that hid sadness, the eyes that looked straight through the lens. As for Robert Wagner, his death decades later closed the circle but didn't answer the question. Some called him guilty, others pitied him, but no one could deny that he had lived the rest of his life as if in quiet penance. His legacy, like Natalie's, became inseparable from the night that defined them both. Together, they remain suspended in memory, the couple who once embodied Hollywood's golden light and then vanished into its shadows. In that sense, their story is the perfect Hollywood parable. Love, beauty, ambition, tragedy, and the endless hunger for truth. Because in the end, Hollywood doesn't believe in closure. It believes in mystery. The waves that carried Natalie away also carried their names into eternity. But even as the world romanticized their tragedy, one question refused to drown. Was it destiny or guilt that kept Robert Wagner silent for 40 years? Some stories refuse to rest, not because the truth is missing, but because every version of it feels incomplete. The tragedy of Natalie Wood and Robert Wagner is one of those stories, half love letter, half confession, and entirely human. After 4 decades of obsession, analysis, and accusations, one thing remains undeniable. 2 lives were shattered that night, and neither ever truly recovered. As a channel that explores Hollywood's forgotten truths, we've revisited the evidence, the testimonies, and the contradictions. What emerges isn't a simple tale of guilt or innocence, it's a portrait of 2 people trapped in a system that demanded perfection, even when their souls were breaking. Natalie Wood was not a helpless victim. She was brilliant, ambitious, and deeply aware of her worth. She had fought since childhood to control her own narrative in an industry that treated her like property. Yet, she was also a woman raised to please, to forgive, and to endure. Her marriage to Wagner embodied that contradiction, love wrapped around fear, passion shadowed by control. Robert Wagner, for his part, was not a monster by design. He was a man built by image, groomed by the studio system to be charming, composed, and powerful. But power, once threatened, has a way of turning fragile men cruel. Whether or not Wagner ever laid a violent hand on Natalie that night, it's clear that jealousy and pride poisoned the air aboard the Splendor. And sometimes tragedy doesn't need intent, only silence, hesitation, and one fatal decision not to act. The moral weight of this story lies in that silence. 4 hours. 4 hours before anyone called for help. In those hours, a life slipped away, and with it, the last chance to rewrite their story. Perhaps that's what has haunted Wagner more than guilt itself. the knowledge that he could have saved her, but didn't. Hollywood's obsession with this case isn't just voyeurism, it's reflection. The dream factory that once celebrated their love also consumed it. Fame turns emotion into performance. Even grief becomes part of the show. And when truth threatens the illusion, it gets rewritten, edited, softened. Natalie's fear of water was real. So was the bruise on her cheek. So was Wagner's love. That's what makes this story so unbearable, the collision of affection and tragedy in the same breath. When the police reopened the investigation in 2011, the world expected justice. But justice in stories like these rarely arrives neatly. The sea took the evidence, time blurred the details, and everyone who might have spoken clearly has grown old, tired, or gone. What remains are echoes, conflicting memories, half-truths, and the hollow sound of unanswered questions. So, what do we believe? That Natalie Wood's death was not an accident, but neither was it cold-blooded murder. It was the final act of a love that had burned too fiercely for too long. A night where jealousy met fear, and fear met silence. A tragedy born not from hatred, but from the fragile, dangerous parts of love itself. Perhaps that's why this story endures. Because in some way, it mirrors all of us, the mistakes we can't undo, the words we wish we hadn't said, the moments when pride silenced compassion. Robert Wagner lived on, but never free. The ocean didn't drown him, guilt did. And Natalie Wood, frozen forever in our collective memory, remains both victim and star, her legend preserved in the waves that took her away. Every time her name is spoken, we resurrect not only her tragedy, but our own longing to understand why love so often ends where silence begins. Some stories never really end. They linger not in headlines or case files, but in the quiet spaces between memory and imagination. The story of Natalie Wood and Robert Wagner is one of those. It lives not just in the mystery of how she died, but in the ache of how they once lived, two souls who chased love through fame, fire, and fate, until the night the sea claimed one of them forever. If you close your eyes, you can almost see it. The glow of a yacht against dark water, laughter turning into silence, the faint reflection of the moon trembling on the waves. In that stillness, you can feel everything they once were. Young, beautiful, flawed, afraid. Hollywood will remember them as symbols. Natalie, the eternal ingenue, and Wagner, the gentleman haunted by what he could not undo. But beyond the tabloids and documentaries, there was something deeply human, two people bound together by longing and undone by pride. Time has washed away the details, but not the emotion. Each new generation rediscovers the photographs, her delicate smile, his confident gaze, and wonders how such perfect love could collapse so completely. Maybe that's why their story endures, because it reminds us that perfection is only a mirage, and that behind every glittering romance lies a quiet war between what we show and what we hide. For those who loved her, Natalie remains a ghost in the golden light of cinema, the woman who could make pain look like poetry. For those who loved him, Wagner remains the man who never stopped paying for one mistake, whether through guilt or through grief. And for everyone else, their names have become a legend carved into the history of Hollywood, a place built on dreams, where tragedy feels like destiny. There's a cruel beauty to it all. The ocean that ended their story also preserved it, keeping it alive in whispers, theories, and the endless human hunger to know the unknowable. Maybe that's what Natalie feared most, not the water itself, but the silence that followed. And yet, in some strange way, that silence became her immortality. More than 40 years later, her eyes still look back from the silver screen with the same defiance, the same vulnerability. When the world watches West Side Story or Splendor in the Grass, they don't see a victim, they see a woman who felt deeply, lived passionately, and paid dearly for both. Robert Wagner, too, found his own kind of immortality not through absolution, but through endurance. For decades, he lived in the long shadow of a single night, never confessing, never escaping. Perhaps that was punishment enough. In the end, what remains is love, complicated, imperfect, destructive, and eternal. The kind of love that doesn't fade when the lights go out, but lingers, heavy and haunting, in the quiet rhythm of waves. Some stories were never meant to be known, but now,